Hey, before we get started, I wanted to remind you that if you are overwhelmed with all the woodworking information and all the advice online and just want a simple, straightforward approach to getting started in woodworking, I've designed a step-by-step system called the Weekend Woodworker that'll get you building your first project this weekend, even if you've never used a single tool in your life. And if you think it's just too expensive to get started in woodworking, I've got a free guide showing you how you can get all the tools you'll need for under $1,000. Head over to mytoollist.com and download the list today. And just so you know, we update it every month, so make sure you've got the current list. When you first start woodworking, you're probably excited and most interested in acquiring tools and learning how to cut and assemble wood without giving much consideration to the wood itself. Understanding these 5 fundamental properties of wood will help you right out of the gate. Keep in mind that mostly what I'm talking about here applies to solid lumber, not plywood, except where noted. A very common rookie technique for joining 2 boards together is to screw one board into the end of another one. I mean, it makes sense. Well, there's actually a name for this. It's called a butt joint. And yeah, I'll bet about half of you giggle every time you hear the term butt joint. And while this is the simplest way to join boards together, it's also the weakest. The problem is that the end grain of a board doesn't have much holding power. When you drive a screw into the end grain, the fibers of the wood tend to spread apart rather than allowing the wood threads to bite into the wood. A nail is even weaker, but the weakest would be trying to make a butt joint with glue. The end grain will just soak up most of the glue and leave you with a very weak bond, or none at all. Always try to join the face or edge of a board to the face or edge of another board. The simplest method is to use pocket screws, which drive in diagonally, grabbing the face grain. I have a whole video on how to properly use pocket screws. There's a link down in the description. A more traditional method would be using a different type of joint instead of a butt joint. These could be dovetails, mortise and tenon joints, box joints. There's a lot of different types of joinery. A rabbet joint is the joint I teach to beginners in my Weekend Woodworker course, but it's also my personal go-to joint. Even after 40 years of woodworking, it's quick and easy to create, and it makes for a very strong connection with glue alone. No screws needed, by allowing face grain to contact face grain. Plus, a rabbet joint looks great and makes squaring up your projects much easier. Now that I've talked about end grain, I want to dive a little deeper into grain direction. When you're building a project and its strength is a concern, it's important to orient the boards the right way. I know this is probably pretty basic, but it can't hurt to emphasize that a board on its edge is much stronger than a board on its face. Just look at the framing of any building or even up in your attic, and you'll see that all the structural boards are on their edges. A board is much stronger and more flexible against the grain rather than along the grain. Take a look at this example. On this piece, it's difficult to break in this direction, but it snaps easily along the grain. Think of it like splitting a log for firewood. Chopping it along its length with the grain is much easier than trying to cut a log in half. I've even seen some karate board breaking demonstrations that use this grain direction to their advantage. The other big thing that new woodworkers often overlook is the appearance of grain in your project. Think about which way the grain should go to make the project aesthetically pleasing. Typically, grain looks best when it runs in the long direction. In other words, think of a table. Traditionally, the boards will run the length of the table rather than a bunch of shorter boards running across the table. Or the panel in a cabinet door. To my eye, it looks odd if it's running horizontally. The grain on drawer faces normally runs horizontally. But keep in mind, these are common design standards rather than rules. I've seen plenty of beautiful and creative exceptions. One final thing about the look of the grain. Take the time to examine the grain patterns of each board you're going to be using and select what areas you want to use for various parts of your project. I think a lot of times it's easy to just start cutting from the end of a board and not really examining the look of the entire board. Maybe the middle part of a board has a particularly interesting pattern. Use that for a featured part of your project and use the rest of the board for secondary surfaces, maybe drawer runners or whatever. If I'm using pine boards, for instance, I like to select the ones that have really pronounced knots or other weird features that many people might consider defects. I think it makes for a much more visually interesting final product. Wood is an organic material, and in many ways it behaves like a living organic material. Unlike metal, wood will expand and contract due to changes in humidity. No topic seems to cause more stress among woodworkers than wood expansion and contraction. First, let me put a lot of your fears to rest. For most projects, especially smaller ones, wood movement isn't a big issue and not something you need to worry about. And if you use plywood, wood movement is never an issue. If you've ever felt a tree limb after it's been cut, you know how wet it is. It has a lot of moisture in it. After a tree is milled, the lumber needs to dry out before using it. Usually this is done long before you purchase it, unless it's a 2x4 from some big box stores. A board can take a year or even longer to dry depending on how thick it is, or it can dry quicker if it's dried in a kiln. Ideally, there's a point where the board's moisture content reaches equilibrium with the humidity of its environment and it becomes relatively stable. That's when it's ready to sell. And as wood dries, it shrinks. One of the worst things to do is build with wet wood. When I built this gate, there were no gaps between these boards. For this project, it didn't really make a difference, but for furniture or other woodworking projects, you need to start with a dried board. Again, most of the wood you buy at lumber yards and home centers is fine, but the opposite can also happen. A rise in humidity can cause a board to expand. This expansion and contraction can occur in any place that experiences large swings in humidity, and some woodworking projects need to be built with this in mind. If not, the project might split or buckle. The good news is that you really only need to account for wood movement on certain projects. There are online calculators that'll tell you exactly how much you can expect a given species of wood to expand, but I don't recommend bothering with those. Most woodworkers never need to know the actual numbers. And if you really want to get into the weeds on this, you'll need to buy a moisture meter. I don't have one, I've never used one, I don't have a need for one. Here's what you need to know. First, wood expands in one direction across the grain. Well, technically it expands along its length a little bit, but this amount is so tiny, you can ignore it. So think about this. Moisture is drawn up through the end grain of a board, just like a tree draws water up its trunk. Once inside, it causes the board to swell outward, spreading the width of the board. On large pieces, say tabletops or solid wood cabinet door panels, this can be substantial enough to require building accordingly. Panels and cabinet doors are usually free floating in grooves to give them some expansion room. But really, all but the most high-end cabinet door panels are made of plywood, so wood movement isn't an issue. Probably the most common place where hobbyist woodworkers will need to build with expansion and contraction in mind is on tabletops. The typical solution is to add breadboards to the end. This single board with a mortise allowing the wood to spread out and keep the tabletop from warping. And there's a number of different methods for making these. Some farmhouse tables don't use breadboard ends at all. The tabletop is then attached to the skirt using clips that can slide along a slot. Solid wood tabletops are never glued into place. I like to use a tabletop as an example because in this case, size matters. The amount of expansion, say a single 3-inch wide board might experience is tiny, maybe a 32nd of an inch or even less. But to make the width of a tabletop, you'd have to join together, say 10 or more of those boards, compounding that measurement to where it is substantial. A typical solid wood dining table might expand a 1/4 inch or more across its width, and it needs to be allowed to do so. But on smaller projects, say boxes or picture frames or whatever, wood movement just isn't enough to really worry about. Expansion and contraction is a non-issue on most of all of the projects I make. Take a look at this printer stand. It's basically a frame and panel construction with a plywood top and side panels. The solid wood frame pieces are just not wide enough to cause any problems. Even if those frames did want to expand a little, there's nothing stopping it. And again, consider the climate where you live. This could be one of the best things about wood or one of the most disappointing. It depends upon your expectations. All wood changes color due to exposure to air, oxidation, and UV exposure from sunlight. This change can be quite remarkable. Most people prize cherry for its rich reddish brown that it transforms into in a relatively short time. In my opinion, aged cherry is one of the most beautiful species of wood. I always think a cherry project looks way better a year after it's built. Most shop furniture and fixtures are made from pine and often unfinished. Pine will gradually develop a much more amber shade over time. Brand new shop fixtures always look so bright white. I like to look at other people's shops and kind of guess when everything was built based on its color. On some species, color change is much more subtle. Maple, for instance, becomes just a little yellower over time, but it's not too dramatic of a difference. To me, this aging process and color change almost always improves the appearance of wood. I really think this is one of the main reasons wood furniture is just so appealing. But there's times when you might be a little disappointed, mostly when using exotic species of wood. Purple Heart, for example, is a stunning purple color when you first buy it, but over time it transforms into a rich, dark chocolate color. Paduk is just about the reddest wood you can buy, but it won't stay that way for too long. Both of these species age beautifully, just different than what they start out as. Just lower your expectations when you first see them at a lumber dealer. You can slow the process a little by applying a finish on the wood, which you're probably gonna do anyway, but even that won't keep the wood its original color forever. And of course, if you intentionally want to change the color of wood, you can apply a stain or dye. And speaking of finishes, always apply a finish to your projects. Well, maybe that's a little extreme. Let me put it this way. Personally, I apply a protective finish on everything but shop projects. But a lot of people like to finish shop projects too, so there's that. I won't go into finishing details here because I have a separate video on that. Be sure to check out that video, links also down in the description. A properly applied clear finish will protect your projects from spills and scratches, as well as providing a bit of protection against UV rays, depending on the type of finish you choose. A varnish, polyurethane, or lacquer finish will also help repel dust, which can easily build up on unfinished wood and get kind of grimy and gross. Another benefit is that a wood finish might reduce the expansion and contraction of wood a little. And while protection is probably the most important reason to apply a finish, the best part is how great a finish will make your projects look. There's just nothing like applying that first brush stroke of polyurethane or spray of lacquer and watching the color of the wood instantly pop. It's really one of my absolute favorite parts of woodworking. It's like a reward after all the hard work of building a project. Thanks for watching.